Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we dive into a shocking family betrayal that ends in murder. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the Larson family appeared to have it all: a beautiful home, two successful parents, and two teenage children, Natalie and Luke. Their father, Daniel, was a well-respected businessman, known in the community for his charm and hard work. He was the kind of man who seemed to balance his career and family life effortlessly. Sarah, his first wife, had tragically passed away when Natalie and Luke were still young, leaving a hole in their lives that seemed impossible to fill. For several years after Sarah's death, Daniel struggled with raising his children alone. He was distant and often overwhelmed by his grief. But then Claire entered his life. She was kind, warm-hearted, and seemed to fill the void that had been left by Sarah. Claire and Daniel met through mutual friends, and their relationship quickly blossomed. She was everything Daniel needed at that moment: compassionate, understanding, and someone who could help him heal. They married within a year of meeting, and Claire became the stepmother to Natalie and Luke. From the start, it was clear that Claire had her work cut out for her. Natalie and Luke, still grieving their mother's death, were initially polite but distant. They were never openly rude, but it was clear they resented Claire's presence in their home. She tried to bridge the gap by being as understanding as possible. She would often cook their favorite meals, attend their school events, and even join them on family outings. She did everything she could to make them feel loved and accepted. However, Claire's presence only seemed to make the divide worse. Natalie, in particular, couldn't stand the thought of someone else filling her mother's shoes. Claire's gentle attempts to connect felt like an invasion of something that was sacred. Luke, though quieter about his feelings, also found it hard to accept the reality of his father's new life. Both children began to resent Claire, blaming her for stealing their father's attention. As the years went on, the situation grew more tense. Daniel, oblivious to the emotional turmoil his children were experiencing, became increasingly absorbed in his work and his relationship with Claire. It seemed as though he had forgotten what it was like to be a single parent. His growing closeness with Claire made Natalie and Luke feel as though they were no longer his priority. They began to feel more like outsiders in their own home, and slowly their bitterness toward Claire turned into something much darker. It was a resentment that no one, not even Daniel, could have anticipated. Over time, Natalie and Luke grew bitter and angry. Their father, once a loving and attentive parent, now seemed completely blind to the tension between his children and Claire. It was as though Daniel had forgotten the way his children used to look up to him, the way they relied on him for comfort. As his relationship with Claire deepened, the distance between father and children grew ever wider. Daniel's attention was now consumed by Claire, who had become his world. To Natalie and Luke, this was a betrayal. At first, their resentment simmered beneath the surface, hidden in small, passive-aggressive comments and subtle acts of rebellion. But as time went on, their frustration reached a boiling point. They no longer wanted to silently endure the situation; they wanted revenge. Their plan wasn't born out of simple jealousy, but a deep sense of abandonment. The people they loved most, first their mother, and now their father, had left them emotionally, and in their minds it was Claire who was the cause of it all. Luke, who had always been the more impulsive of the two, was the first to suggest something drastic. He believed that the only way to get rid of Claire completely was to eliminate her from their lives. He spoke to Natalie about his growing anger, about how they could never have their father back unless Claire was gone. At first, Natalie recoiled at the thought. Murder wasn't something she had ever considered, no matter how much she hated Claire. But the idea gnawed at her, and slowly she began to see it as the only way to restore balance to their family. After all, she reasoned, Claire had stolen their father from them. In their minds, this was justice. Luke was the one who pushed for action, suggesting that they make Claire's death look like an accident. This would ensure that their father would be free of her, and perhaps in the aftermath, their family could return to what it had once been. Natalie reluctantly agreed. The plan took shape slowly, with the siblings watching Claire's every move, searching for a moment when they could strike without being caught. They began to focus on her habits, her routines, and the places she liked to visit on her own. It was a game of patience, waiting for the perfect time to act. In their minds, it was the only way to get their lives back. And so they prepared, every day becoming more convinced that what they were doing was necessary. They were driven by the belief that their revenge would set things right. One evening, the opportunity came. Daniel had to work late, leaving Claire alone at home with the children. This was the moment Natalie and Luke had been waiting for. They had carefully planned everything down to the smallest detail, and now, with their father out of the house, they knew it was time to put their plan into action. The house felt eerily quiet as the siblings prepared to leave, the weight of what they were about to do hanging heavily between them. Claire, as usual, had decided to go for an evening walk. She enjoyed these solitary walks through the neighborhood, finding solace in the peaceful surroundings as the sun began to set. It was a routine she followed every night, a habit that made her predictable and vulnerable. Natalie and Luke, fully aware of her schedule, decided to follow her without her knowing. They kept a safe distance, making sure she wouldn't notice them as they trailed behind her, watching her every move. The tension in the air was thick, and their hearts raced in anticipation. They followed Claire to the secluded part of the neighborhood, a wooded area on the outskirts, far enough from their home to avoid detection. It was the perfect place to carry out their plan. Claire had no idea that danger was creeping closer with every step she took. She was lost in thought, enjoying the cool evening air, unaware that her life was about to be violently ripped away. When they reached the wooded area, the siblings made their move. They approached Claire from behind, making sure they had the element of surprise. Without warning, Luke lunged at her, grabbing her from behind and wrapping a rope around her neck. Claire struggled, gasping for air, but she was caught off guard. The siblings worked together, determined to end this once and for all. They didn't want her to fight back, so they tightened the rope with ruthless efficiency, cutting off her air supply. Claire's struggles grew weaker, her body going limp as the life drained from her. It was over quickly, too quickly. Once she was unconscious, they made sure her body showed no signs of resistance. They didn't want to leave any trace that could point back to them. Natalie and Luke carefully dragged her lifeless body to a nearby thicket, concealing it as best as they could. The area was far enough from the main road that it was unlikely anyone would stumble upon it until morning. They knew their work wasn't done. With Claire's body hidden, they carefully wiped down the area, making sure there was no evidence that could link them to the crime. Their hearts pounded as they returned home, slipping back into their roles as innocent children mourning the loss of their stepmother. Everything had gone according to plan. It was only a matter of time before they would have their father back. When Daniel returned home that evening, he was greeted by an atmosphere of unsettling silence. Normally, Claire would have been there to welcome him, but tonight the house felt cold and empty. He assumed she was out on one of her evening walks, as she often did. But as the hours passed and Claire didn't return, he began to grow concerned. By the time it was late enough for him to start worrying, Natalie and Luke came to him, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They claimed they hadn't seen Claire for hours and had no idea where she could be. Daniel immediately began calling her phone, but there was no answer. Panic began to set in. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but he couldn't bring himself to believe that anything truly sinister had happened. After all, Claire had never been the type to just disappear without a word. But as the minutes turned into hours, the silence of the house grew more deafening. Daniel decided to call the police, fearing that something had happened to Claire. The investigation began the next morning, with police canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing neighbors, and searching the nearby woods. When they found Claire's body, it seemed to confirm Daniel's worst fears. Her death was a tragic mystery. There were no obvious signs of struggle, and the scene appeared staged. It looked as though someone had attacked her from behind, leaving her body in a secluded area with little evidence to go on. The police were baffled, unable to make sense of the crime. Daniel was devastated. He couldn't believe his wife was gone, and the realization hit him like a wave. His grief consumed him, and his world seemed to crumble in an instant. He had lost Claire in the most brutal way possible, and as much as he wanted to pull himself together for his children, he could barely function. Natalie and Luke, seeing their father's pain, pretended to grieve as well, their faces twisted in sorrow. To the outside world, they were the picture of heartbroken children who had lost their second mother. Daniel clung to them for support, but deep down he was lost, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The police had few leads, but they were determined to find answers. They questioned everyone, including Natalie and Luke, but there were no obvious clues that could point to the killer. The investigation continued, but the family began to fall apart as the days dragged on. Daniel, drowning in his grief, withdrew even further into himself. The detectives found themselves running into dead ends, and soon, the tragedy began to feel like it would remain unsolved forever. Meanwhile, the siblings went on, playing their roles as victims, never once letting on that the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. Despite their efforts to cover their tracks, one small detail gave them away. A small piece of fabric, torn from Luke's jacket, was found near Claire's body. It didn't seem significant at first, but when it was tested, the evidence was undeniable. The investigators had finally found a lead, and it led straight to Luke. They were careful, though, not to reveal too much to the siblings. The detectives began to piece together other small inconsistencies in their stories. Both Natalie and Luke had been less distraught than expected in the aftermath of Claire's death, and their actions seemed oddly detached from the tragedy they claimed to feel. The police continued to dig deeper into the siblings' behavior, hoping to find something that would connect them to the crime. They re-interviewed Natalie and Luke separately, and it wasn't long before their stories started to fall apart. Inconsistencies in their accounts began to emerge, small details they couldn't quite get right or changes in their timelines that didn't match up. At first, the siblings held strong, maintaining their facade of innocence. But the pressure of the investigation, combined with the mounting guilt, eventually began to crack their resolve. The more the police questioned them, the more their nerves began to unravel. It was Luke who finally broke first. After hours of questioning, the weight of the truth was too much for him to bear. He confessed to the murder, explaining how he and Natalie had planned everything from the beginning. The desire for revenge against their father, the need to remove Claire from their lives, had driven them to kill. Luke explained in detail how they had followed Claire on that fateful evening and carried out the murder with cold, calculated precision. Natalie, when confronted with the truth, also broke down and confessed. She admitted to playing her part in the crime, revealing how they had worked together to cover their tracks and make Claire's death look like an accident. The truth came to light in a shocking and brutal confession. The siblings had murdered their stepmother, not out of fear or self-defense, but out of a twisted need to regain their father's love and attention. A crime, which they had thought would restore their family, had instead destroyed it beyond repair. Daniel, already devastated by the loss of his wife, was crushed by the revelation that his own children were responsible for her death. The betrayal was too much for him to process. The children he had raised, the ones he had loved and cared for, had turned against him in the most unimaginable way. They had killed Claire, and in doing so, had destroyed everything that had once been their family. The siblings were arrested, and their lives were forever changed, but it was clear that the damage to the Larson family was irreversible. The tragic ending left a lasting scar on all involved, a reminder that sometimes revenge can destroy everything in its path,